The fog lifted slowly from the Dutch countryside, revealing what remained of Jake McNiece's carefully laid plans scattered across 2 kilometers of muddy fields and broken hedgerows. October 1944, somewhere between Eindhoven and Veghel, and Operation Market Garden had devolved into the kind of desperate improvisation that made staff officers back in England reach for their whiskey bottles. McNiece crouched behind the collapsed stone wall, his Browning automatic rifle growing heavier with each passing minute, watching German soldiers move through the abandoned farmhouse with methodical precision. The canvas satchel containing his last 3 blocks of TNT sat beside him in the mud, its waterproof coating slick with morning dew. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the charges he'd been saving for the bridge at Veghel, the same bridge that now felt like a lifetime away from this drainage ditch where 3 wounded paratroopers waited for him to figure out how to keep them alive. The detonation cord coiled around the TNT had seemed like plenty when they'd jumped 12 hours ago. Now, with German armor rolling up the road and friendly lines somewhere beyond the canal, every foot of that precious fuse wire represented the difference between covering a retreat and watching good men die in an open field. Behind him, Private Coleman shifted restlessly in the ditch, his leg wrapped in a torn undershirt that had already soaked through with blood. The kid kept whispering about his foot going numb, about how he couldn't feel his toes anymore, but McNiece silenced him with a sharp gesture. Sound carried differently in this flat country, and the German patrol, sweeping toward their position, moved like they knew exactly where to look. Someone had talked, or maybe they'd just gotten unlucky. In McNiece's experience, luck and planning were about equally reliable when the shooting started. The young German soldier appeared through the mist exactly where McNiece had expected, following the hedgerow that bordered their hiding place, moving with the nervous energy of someone who'd been told there were American paratroopers in the area, but couldn't see where they might be hiding. McNiece tracked him through the bar's iron sights, feeling the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Once he pulled that trigger, every German unit within 5 kilometers would converge on this position. The wounded men behind him would have maybe 10 minutes to crawl toward the canal before the net closed completely. But that was the job, wasn't it? Jake McNiece, demolition NCO and chronic discipline problem, keeping the Filthy 13's reputation intact by doing the things other people called impossible or suicidal. The canvas satchel seemed to pulse beside him like a heartbeat, reminding him of all the bridges he'd blown, all the roads he'd cratered, all the neat little explosions that had bought time and space for men to live another day. This time felt different, though. This time, the charges in that bag might be the last ones he'd ever set. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The bar erupted in McNiece's hands with a sound like thunder splitting the morning silence. His controlled bursts swept across the German skirmish line, catching one soldier in the open and sending the others diving for whatever cover they could find among the hedgerows and farm buildings. The recoil hammered against his shoulder as muzzle flashes bloomed from German positions, the distinctive buzzsaw rip of an MG-42 joining the symphony of small arms fire that turned the quiet Dutch countryside into a killing ground. McNiece dropped behind the stone wall as machine gun bullets chewed mortar and rock inches from his head, the German gunner walking his fire methodically along the wall's length. Through gaps in the ancient stones, he could see enemy soldiers moving to flank his position, exactly what he'd expected, exactly what he'd planned for. The canvas satchel with its precious cargo of TNT blocks sat within arm's reach, but the detonation cord inside wouldn't help him here. Those charges were meant for something bigger than a squad-level firefight, something that would justify the risk he was taking with 3 wounded men's lives. Behind him, Coleman and the other wounded paratroopers began their desperate crawl toward the canal, using the covering fire to mask their movement through the drainage ditches that crisscrossed the flat terrain. The plan was working, But McNiece could already hear the distant rumble of vehicle engines approaching from the north, German reinforcements responding to the contact, probably a full platoon or more. His ammunition pouches held 3 20-round magazines, enough for maybe 5 more minutes of sustained fire before the bar fell silent. From his position near the supply dump 2 kilometers south, Staff Sergeant Wilson heard the firefight erupt and immediately reached for his field telephone. As the 506th Ammunition NCO, Wilson had watched McNiece draw those TNT blocks 3 days earlier, had signed the requisition form that put high explosives in the hands of a man who treated military regulations like suggestions. Now, listening to the sustained bursts of automatic weapons fire echoing across the Dutch countryside, Wilson wondered if those charges would ever reach their intended target at the Veghel Bridge. The MG-42 fell silent, either destroyed or repositioning, and McNiece used the momentary lull to shift position along the wall. The fog was lifting rapidly now, reducing his concealment and giving the Germans clearer fields of fire. He popped up at a new location and triggered another burst at enemy soldiers, sprinting between buildings, then dropped down as return fire peppered his previous position. The deadly chess match continued, each move calculated to keep German attention focused on him, rather than the wounded men crawling through the mud toward safety. In the farmhouse, Obergefreiter Klaus Müller pressed himself against a bullet-scarred wall and tried to control his breathing. 3 years of war had taught him to recognize the sound of different weapons, and the American automatic rifle hammering their position carried a distinctive rhythm that spoke of an experienced gunner. Müller's squad leader was shouting orders about flanking movements and establishing fields of fire, but all the young German soldier could think about was how quickly their routine patrol had turned into a firefight that seemed designed to pin them down while something else happened elsewhere. McNiece fired his last burst from the bar and began his fighting withdrawal toward the canal, using every hedgerow and drainage ditch to mask his movements south. The empty weapon felt like dead weight in his hands, but abandoning it was unthinkable. Behind him, German voices coordinated pursuit, but the sounds grew fainter as he increased the distance between himself and the contact area. The canvas satchel bounced against his back as he ran, its cargo of TNT blocks and detonation cord waiting for whatever target the chaos of Market Garden would throw at him next. 20 minutes later, McNiece collapsed beside the canal bank, where Coleman and the other wounded paratroopers waited in the shelter of a concrete culvert. The kid's face had gone grey with blood loss and shock, but he managed a weak grin when McNiece appeared through the morning mist like some mud-caked ghost from the drainage ditches. Behind them, sporadic rifle fire still echoed from the German positions, but the enemy had apparently decided not to pursue across the open ground that led to the waterline. "Made it, Sergeant," Coleman whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle lap of canal water against the concrete sides. "Thought maybe you were gonna stay back there and blow something up just for the hell of it." McNiece unslung the canvas satchel and checked its contents, running his fingers over the TNT blocks and the carefully coiled detonation cord that represented his remaining demolition capability. Market Garden was supposed to have been a quick thrust to the Rhine, a bold stroke that would end the war by Christmas. Instead, it had become a grinding series of desperate stands at bridges and crossroads, with scattered airborne units fighting to hold objectives that seemed to shift with every radio transmission from higher headquarters. Lieutenant Morrison appeared from a concealed position near the canal crossing, his uniform torn and mud-stained from 3 days of fighting disconnected battles across the Dutch countryside. As the 506th Acting Company commander, Morrison had watched his neat tactical plans dissolve into improvisation and survival, with NCOs like McNiece making life-or-death decisions that no field manual had prepared them for. "McNiece, I need those charges at the Veghel Bridge," Morrison said without preamble. "Intelligence says German armor is moving up from the south. If we can't hold the bridge, we need to drop it before marker fees start rolling across." "How many men you got between here and there, Lieutenant?" McNiece asked, adjusting his grip on the satchel straps. "Because that's 4 kilometers through country the Krauts have been working over for 2 days. Morrison consulted his map, though they both knew the neat-colored lines bore little resemblance to the chaotic reality of scattered drop zones and shifting front lines. Radio communications had been sporadic since the jump, with conflicting reports about British armour advancing from the south and German counterattacks cutting the corridor in multiple places. The Weigel Bridge remained vital to the operation's success, but reaching it alive was another matter entirely. Wilson's voice crackled through the field telephone at Morrison's command post, reporting ammunition shortages and casualty figures that painted a grim picture of the 506th's combat effectiveness. 3 companies scattered across 20 square kilometers of enemy territory, with McNiece's small demolition capability representing one of their few remaining tactical options. The staff sergeant had already logged those TNT blocks as expended, writing them off when the firefight erupted that morning. McNiece studied the canal's southern bank, noting the German positions visible through the lifting fog and calculating movement times through terrain that offered minimal concealment. The detonation cord in his satchel would reach maybe 50 meters from a protected firing position, enough to drop a bridge span, but only if he could get close enough to place the charges without getting cut down by machine gun fire. "I'll take 2 men and move after dark," he told Morrison. "But if we run into serious opposition, those charges might end up in a different place than your map shows." The lieutenant nodded, understanding that McNiece's reputation for improvisation came with risks that couldn't be calculated on paper. Market Garden had already demonstrated the gap between planning and execution, with airborne units adapting to situations their training had never quite prepared them for. Coleman watched the exchange from his position beside the culvert, recognizing the familiar tension that preceded McNiece's most dangerous missions. The wounded paratrooper had seen the demolition sergeant work before, had watched him turn impossible situations into narrow victories through a combination of technical skill and calculated recklessness that bordered on genius or insanity, depending on your perspective. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The Weigel Bridge materialized through the pre-dawn darkness like a steel skeleton against the lighter sky, its girders humming with the vibration of German vehicles moving across the span in both directions. McNiece crouched in the drainage ditch 50 meters from the structure's southern approach, listening to the mechanical rhythm of what sounded like at least a company of armored vehicles using his target as their primary supply route. The canvas satchel felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that those 3 TNT blocks might be the only thing standing between German armor and the scattered remnants of the 506th Parachute Infantry. Private Jenkins pressed himself against the muddy bank beside McNiece, his Springfield rifle useless against the kind of firepower rolling across that bridge. Behind them, Corporal Hayes maintained watch on their escape route, though all 3 men understood that survival depended on completing the mission rather than planning a tactical withdrawal. The detonation cord coiled in McNiece's satchel would stretch exactly 47 meters when unrolled, barely enough to reach a firing position that might offer some protection from the blast, assuming he could place the charges on the bridge's primary support structure. "Jesus, Sarge," Jenkins whispered as another convoy rumbled overhead. "That's a lot of steel to bring down with 3 blocks." McNiece studied the bridge's construction in the faint starlight, calculating load-bearing points and blast angles with the instinctive engineering sense that had kept him alive through Normandy and into Holland. The Germans had positioned machine gun teams at both approaches, with roving patrols covering the riverbank beneath the span. Getting close enough to emplace charges would require moving through a kill zone that offered minimal concealment, but the alternative was watching German armor roll south to cut off what remained of Market Garden's northern corridor. Lieutenant Morrison's voice echoed in his memory. Drop the bridge before enemy tanks could use it to reinforce their positions around Eindhoven. Simple orders that ignored the tactical reality of emplacing demolitions under fire, with insufficient explosive and a fuse train that left no margin for error. McNiece had done impossible things before, but this felt different, more desperate, with higher stakes and fewer options for improvisation. The canvas satchel seemed to pulse with potential energy as McNiece removed the TNT blocks and began rigging them for maximum structural effect. His fingers worked automatically, muscle memory from dozens of training exercises and real-world demolitions guiding the placement of detonation cord and blasting caps. The charges would need to be positioned on the bridge's main support columns, shaped to direct explosive force, where it would do the most damage to steel and concrete. Hayes spotted the German patrol moving along the riverbank 30 seconds before they would have stumbled into the demolition team's position. 3 enemy soldiers with submachine guns following a route that would bring them within 10 meters of McNiece's work area. Jenkins started to raise his rifle, but McNiece stopped him with a sharp gesture. Shooting would alert every German position within a kilometer, turning their careful approach into a running firefight that none of them could survive. Instead, McNiece finished rigging the charges in absolute silence, his hands steady despite the approaching footsteps and the knowledge that discovery meant certain death. The detonation cord snaked back toward their concealed position, its length carefully calculated to provide just enough standoff distance from the blast. When the explosion came, it would bring down 30 meters of bridge span and probably half the riverbank along with it. The German patrol passed within arm's reach of their hiding spot, close enough for McNiece to smell tobacco smoke and hear whispered conversation about the quality of Dutch coffee requisitioned from local civilians. For 3 endless minutes, enemy soldiers stood directly above the freshly emplaced demolitions, discussing guard rotations and speculating about American paratrooper activity in the area. McNiece held his breath, feeling the blasting cap's electrical leads in his left hand, while his right gripped the firing device that would send current down 47 meters of detonation cord. When the patrol finally moved on, continuing their circuit of the bridge perimeter, McNiece allowed himself one shallow breath before beginning the countdown that would make Market Garden history. The TNT blocks waited in the darkness below the steel span, positioned to maximize structural damage and minimize the time German engineers would need to assess what had happened. In 30 seconds, the Weggel Bridge would cease to exist as a tactical asset. McNiece's hand froze on the firing device as the sound of American voices drifted down from the bridge above. Not German, American. English, spoken with the flat vowels of the Midwest, carried on the night air along with the distinctive jingle of airborne equipment and the measured pace of men who'd been walking for hours. A patrol from Easy Company, moving across what they thought was a secure bridge, directly over 3 blocks of TNT rigged to blow on electrical command. The official after-action report would never mention this moment. 60 years later, historians would write about McNiece's bold demolition of the Weggel Bridge as a textbook example of airborne initiative, describing how the Filthy 13's demolition sergeant single-handedly denied a crucial crossing to German armor. They wouldn't record the 30 seconds when Jake McNiece crouched in a drainage ditch with his finger on a firing device, listening to American paratroopers joke about Dutch beer while walking directly into the kill radius of his carefully placed charges. Jenkins started to call out a warning, but McNiece silenced him with a gesture that carried the weight of absolute command. Shouting would alert the German machine gun teams and turn the bridge into a killing ground for both the Easy Company patrol and his own demolition team. But firing the charges with Americans on the span meant vaporizing men who jumped into Holland with the same hopes and fears that had carried McNiece through 3 years of war. The voices grew clearer as the patrol approached the bridge's center span directly above the primary demolition point. Sergeant Talbot's distinctive laugh echoed off the steel girders, followed by someone complaining about the weight of ammunition loads and speculation about when British armour might finally link up with the scattered airborne units. Normal conversation between tired soldiers, carrying the easy familiarity of men who'd survived Normandy together and trusted each other to survive Holland as well. McNiece felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill, his finger resting on the firing device while seconds ticked past like hours. The German convoy that had crossed earlier would be followed by another, probably within minutes. Delaying the demolition increased the risk that enemy armor would use the bridge to reinforce positions that could cut off the entire Market Garden corridor. But destroying it now meant killing Americans who had no idea they were walking across a primed demolition site. Hayes pressed against the muddy bank beside him, understanding the tactical situation without need for explanation. The corporal had served with McNiece since Normandy, had watched him make impossible decisions under circumstances that reduced choices to simple mathematics of survival. This time felt different, though, more personal, with consequences that would echo in nightmares and sleepless nights for decades to come. The Easy Company patrol reached the bridge's northern approach, their voices fading as they moved toward whatever objective had brought them across the span at this precise, impossible moment. McNiece counted to 30, ensuring the Americans had cleared the demolition radius, before his finger found the firing device again. The German machine gun positions remained active, and reconnaissance reports indicated enemy armor moving up from Eindhoven. The bridge still needed to fall, but something had changed in those 30 seconds of hesitation. The mission remained the same: deny the crossing to German forces, but the weight of decision had shifted in ways that McNiece couldn't fully articulate. He'd always prided himself on following instinct over regulation, on making choices that kept his men alive regardless of what staff officers expected. This time, instinct and duty had briefly pointed in opposite directions, creating a moment of moral vertigo that would outlive the war itself. The charges detonated with a roar that shattered the pre-dawn silence, lifting 30 meters of bridge span into the air before dropping twisted steel and concrete into the river below. German machine guns opened fire immediately, muzzle flashes blooming along both banks as enemy positions responded to what they assumed was an artillery strike. McNiece and his team began their withdrawal through the drainage ditches, moving by feel through terrain that had suddenly become extremely hostile. Behind them, the Wegel Bridge burned in the darkness, its destruction ensuring that German armor would need to find another route south toward the Market Garden corridor. The mission was complete, successful by any tactical measure, but McNiece carried something else away from that riverbank. The memory of 30 seconds when he'd held other men's lives in his hands and discovered that heroism sometimes meant choosing between two versions of doing the right thing. The farmhouse cellar where McNiece wrote his after-action report smelled of wet stone and candle wax, with maps covering every available surface and radio static providing constant background noise. October dawn leaked through small windows, illuminating handwriting that reduced the night's events to tactical essentials. Bridge demolished, enemy crossing denied, no friendly casualties. Lieutenant Morrison would forward the report through channels where it would eventually become part of the official record of Operation Market Garden's desperate improvisations. But paperwork couldn't capture the sound of American voices on a bridge rigged to explode, or the weight of decision that had compressed infinity into 30 seconds of absolute moral clarity. McNiece set down his pencil and reached for the canvas satchel that had carried those TNT blocks across half of occupied Holland. Empty now, stained with mud and cordite residue, the bag would follow him through the rest of the war and into whatever peace awaited beyond Germany's eventual surrender. Staff Sergeant Wilson appeared in the cellar doorway, carrying ammunition resupply and casualty reports that painted the larger picture of Market Garden's mixed success. The bridge demolition had indeed prevented German armor from reinforcing positions around Eindhoven, but British forces remained stalled, short of their objectives further north. The operation would be remembered as a bridge too far, with airborne units paying the price for optimistic planning and insufficient ground support. "Good work at Weigel," Wilson said, consulting his logistics notebook. "I'm writing off those TNT blocks as combat expenditure. Clean demolition, from what I hear." McNiece nodded without elaborating, understanding that some aspects of combat never made it into official records. Wilson had probably lost sleep, worrying about high explosives signed out to a man with McNiece's reputation for creative interpretation of orders. The successful mission would ease concerns about ammunition accountability, while adding another layer to the legend that had begun forming around the Filthy 13's most notorious troublemaker. Jenkins and Hayes maintained their own silence about the bridge operation, sharing the weight of what they'd witnessed without need for discussion. Combat created bonds that transcended normal friendship, forging connections between men who'd seen each other make choices that revealed character under ultimate pressure. They'd watched McNiece hesitate for 30 seconds that could have changed everything, then commit to a decision that balanced competing loyalties with surgical precision. Coleman found McNiece 3 days later at a field aid station near Uden. His leg wound, stabilized enough to allow conversation, but severe enough to guarantee evacuation to a hospital in England. The wounded paratrooper wanted to thank the demolition sergeant for the covering fire that had saved his life, but the words felt inadequate for what had passed between them in that drainage ditch outside Eindhoven. "Heard you dropped the bridge clean," Coleman said instead. "No complications." McNiece studied the kid's face, recognizing the effort to appear casual while discussing events that neither of them would ever fully understand. Combat taught lessons that couldn't be translated into civilian language, creating experiences that remained locked inside the men who'd lived through them. The canvas satchel sat beside McNiece's bunk, waiting for whatever demolition mission would come next. Years later, when historians interviewed McNiece about Market Garden and the Filthy 13's role in airborne operations, he would describe the Weigel Bridge as a straightforward, tactical problem, solved with 3 blocks of TNT and careful timing. The official citation accompanying his Bronze Star would mention conspicuous gallantry in action against an armed enemy, without exploring the moral complexity of choices made in darkness beside a Dutch river. But sometimes, decades after the war, the sound of a freight train crossing a steel bridge would bring it all back: the weight of the firing device in his hand, the voices of American paratroopers walking unknowingly toward their own destruction, and 30 seconds when heroism had looked exactly like hesitation. The canvas satchel, stored in an Oklahoma closet beside faded uniforms and tarnished medals, remained empty of everything except memory. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.